So welcome. This is our monthly utilization-focused evaluation webinar, where this month we are going to be talking about Principle 2, which is personalize. We'll get into that in a moment, but first I want to begin, as we do each month, with a land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that utilization-focused evaluation roots are in Minnesota, the home of Dakota people who have cared for this land for thousands of years. Many Anishinaabe people also call this land home, and Indigenous people from other Native nations also live here and have made innumerable contributions to the land and the region. And Michael and I are settlers on this land. Our ancestors come from what became known as the United States from Ireland, England, and Scotland. They participated in and benefited from attempted genocide and enslavement of sub-Saharan Africans. And despite centuries of colonial theft and violence, we know that this is still Indigenous land. It has always been and always will be Indigenous land. And we have a responsibility to interrupt the generational legacies of colonialism, racism, and genocide. So we have committed to redistributing the royalties from this book to two organizations who are working to support Indigenous language and culture and Indigenous environmentalism. And so by being here today, you're helping us support those organizations, and we will continue to find ways to partner to undo the legacies that we have inherited. I also want to set a little bit of context for today's webinar here in the United States. It's Earth Week. Friday is Earth Day. And I thought it was a fitting example of the personal factor, because when Earth Day was founded in 1970, 52 years ago, Senator Gaylord Nelson said, "Environment is all of America and its problems. It is rats in the ghetto, it is hungry child in a land of affluence, it is housing that is not worthy of the name, neighborhoods not fit to inhabit." And the thing that he and others who were sparking this movement wanted to understand was that everyone is touched by environmental degradation, and the environmental movement, while highly flawed and not as inclusive as it probably should have or could have been, really did try to personalize environmentalism and help people make that connection between their own lives and the environment, a connection that Indigenous people had been holding dear for a long time, and that many settlers did not. And so it was really trying to reconnect those things. So I just thought it was fitting to center ourselves in that acknowledgement of Earth Day, and it also connects to the Blue Marble evaluation principle of skin in the game. So welcome to all our Blue Marble evaluators here, really making that connection of that we all have a stake in the future of our planet. So with that context, we'll get started. And for those of you who've joined us for a few months now, this will be a little bit of a review, but just wanted to always start with the overarching principle of utilization-focused evaluation that we elevate in this 5th edition of the book, which is to focus on intended use by and with intended users in every aspect and every stage of an evaluation. And so that is the overarching principle that guides all utilization-focused evaluations. And then there are 10 operating principles. Last month, we started with the first, which is to contextualize. And this month, we're going to look more closely at this idea of personalizing, honor the personal factor, and identify and engage with primary intended users of the evaluation. And so we're going to dig into a little bit more of what that means today, and we'll hear some stories from our work, and then we'll have some time for questions. And certainly, if you have questions come up, please feel free to put them in the chat. Since I'm solo for the first part, I may, I'll try to pause when I see them, but I may not have the chance to get to them right away. So if you have something urgent, you can also feel free to raise your hand and I'll see you pop up on my screen. So we talk about the critical success factors. There are 5 key variables that are absolutely critical in evaluation use, and those are people, 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 people. So I played people, Oh People from Patti LaBelle as you were entering. There are lots of songs I could have chosen, but I was feeling Patti LaBelle this morning, and we're really talking here about the importance of people and the role that they play in evaluation use. And what we call that the personal factor, which is the presence of an identifiable individual or group of people who personally care about the evaluation and the findings that it generates. These are people who actively seek information to make judgments and reduce decision uncertainties. And Michael engaged in research on evaluation use beginning in 1975, which is what led to the first edition of Utilization-Focused Evaluation. And for this webinar, he prepared a history of that research. And rather than play it for you, we'll send it out. It ended up being, maybe those of you who know Michael, not surprisingly, a little bit on the long side. But also super interesting, I think, for particularly those of us of the maybe 2nd or 3rd generation of evaluators who kind of take the personal factor for granted. One of the things that he talks about was, when he first was doing that research, he was working at the Minnesota Center for Sociological Research when he was doing an analysis of the utilization of the utilization of federal health evaluation programs. And he and his colleagues found time and again that the single most important factor for managers and decision makers when it came to evaluation use was whether or not people wanted to use the evaluation, whether they found it useful. And so for me, as someone who grew up in a household of utilization-focused evaluation, it's not that surprising to me to hear that. But if you look at the quote that Michael had in his report in 1975, he was really coming out of this sociological research lens where the dominant approach is to look for underlying social conditions rather than actions of individuals. So in many ways, it went against everything that he had been taught. And so, it's just important to kind of keep that front and center. And there are still certainly people who take much more of an organizational lens, and certainly systems are critical, and looking at systems factors are important, but you can't forget that people make up systems, and that we really do have to look at how those people are engaged in evaluation to make it useful and used. And so we call those people in our utilization-focused evaluation world primary intended users. And this is a little joke about, there are two industries that call their customers users: illegal drug users, drugs, and software. And so we add evaluation to that. And language does really matter. And so we're going to talk about, moving from in the original days, there was an audience for evaluation. And then we moved to stakeholders, which I'll talk about a little bit next. And then we really get deeper into primary intended users. And so when we say that, these are really the people who have the ability and the interest in using the evaluation findings, not just being affected by them, but actually using them. So we have 10 tips for identifying primary intended users. And the first is starting with this idea of stakeholders. So evaluation stakeholders are people who have a stake or a vested interest in evaluation findings. So for any evaluation, there are multiple potential stakeholders: program funders, staff, administrators, clients, program participants. These are people who have a decision authority over the program. So policymakers, funders, people who have a direct responsibility for the program, the intended beneficiaries of the program, their family, their community, and people who might be disadvantaged by the program or, potentially lost funding opportunities. There are, others who may have a direct or indirect interest in the program or the initiative, the general public, taxpayers. You can go out. So it's important to figure out what are your boundaries here? What stakeholders are you really interested in connecting with? And then, really paying attention to the interests that they hold. There may be competing interests of different stakeholders, and no evaluation can answer all of the questions that all stakeholders might have. So you're going to have some process for narrowing down the range of possible questions to focus in the evaluation. And we get to that in one of our later principles of how to do that. But really the process begins by narrowing the list of potential stakeholders to a much shorter, more specific group of primary intended users. So they're looking at their information needs, their intended use to focus the evaluation. And I will also note that some object to the term stakeholders because, it's not like ordinary people refer to themselves as stakeholders, and it can be kind of jargony. And, it also has some connotations of, like a business stake in something, or a little bit, cold. And some people, may have privilege over others, and, some stakes may have privilege over others. And so, the language that we use to identify who's involved and whose interests are represented, it is a negotiation. It is important to think about the power dynamics of different stakeholders. And, for us, the point is really to identify, recruit, and engage a reasonable number of people who are representing diverse perspectives and interest groups, including the voices of those who have been historically excluded or marginalized, to form an evaluation advisory group of primary intended users to engage together in establishing priority evaluation purposes, questions, and methods. So the next tip is to know who you're looking for. So within that, as you've sort of narrowed the idea of stakeholders, it helps to have criteria in mind. And some of the personal factor considerations to look for are interest, openness, influence, importance, availability, connections, and capacity for contributing to evaluation in its use. And so in the book, we offer this TikTok framework for identifying primary intended users to kind of help you really think about, what are some of the different criteria that you would use to think about who to engage in the process. The next tip is to conduct a stakeholder analysis. So one form of analysis aims to distinguish different degrees of power and interest, which can affect personal involvement of different stakeholders. So for example, those with high interest and considerable power can be excellent candidates to become primary intended users. Those with high power but low interest might be obstacles to use. And so they would need to be cultivated, paying attention to them and engaging them perhaps in a different way. Those with high interest but relatively low power might provide connections to those with power and really be willing to put in the work to get the information that's necessary to speak truth to power. Those with low interest and little power, perhaps the intended beneficiaries might require some additional attention and support to really get them engaged and participate in the evaluation. And also I would emphasize that those with low interest, really little interest and little power should not be ignored. Really the contrary, these are the voices that are often unheard and need to be cultivated and empowered and to contribute to their experiences and perspective to the evaluation. And yes, I can share these slides as well as the recording that will all go out in the email that I send after this. So, one example here is just to think about, who your commissioner potentially is of an evaluation. likely, high power and high interest, to really think about how those folks are being engaged directly and start having those conversations about who else might need to be in the room. So we are working currently with an organization that works closely with schools and districts. And often, there's a group of administrators at the leadership level that they're working with that are, they've got access to the funding and, are making the decisions, and they're really interested in getting these programs into the classroom. But it's really important to think about engaging the students and the teachers who maybe have more of that low interest and low power in the actual evaluation process, but are going to have the most valuable perspectives in a lot of ways. And how do you ensure that there's a process that's inclusive to folks across the system and not just in that high power and high interest group? And so one of the things that this group does is they engage in talking circles, or they call them story circles, where they make sure that there are opportunities for different voices to be heard and to see data that's coming out and have a chance to respond and react and share their lived experiences with them. And they've embedded that across the district so that it's used as an ongoing way to really continue to elevate the voices of students and parents and educators in decision-making processes. Okay, so move on to the fourth tip, which is to be politically and culturally sensitive and, think about who has a stake and why they want to be involved. So as I said, trying to really recruit intended users who represent important stakeholder constituencies and finding tipping point connectors, people who are important and credible communicators in their stakeholder network and organization. So going back to that example of organization working in a district, really finding early adopters who have influence, with other teachers and who have been in the district long enough to have built relationships across multiple buildings, have been really important for them to kind of bring others along on the journey, and be willing to use their relationships to move the work forward. And, politically and realistically, evaluators don't have complete control over the selection of primary intended users. So those who fund or commission evaluation may have some say in who's involved as primary intended users. They may want to be involved themselves, though, it's important to sort of check and make sure that that's a genuine interest, and really kind of have those conversations about how they see their role. They might just be doing the job of, getting the evaluation started and prefer not to be personally involved. So it's wise to kind of begin by strategizing with them about the role they want to play. And, sometimes they want to play the role of gatekeepers that control access into who the evaluator involves. So really it's important to make them allies and really help them see the value in engaging other primary intended users, and that the evaluation's credibility is really going to depend on who's involved. Others who involve may be, director or board members. So the situation analysis, which we talked about in the first principle, the contextualized principle, should help you to uncover who some of those primary intended users might be. The fifth tip is to determine levels of stakeholder involvement. So we kind of have 5 different roles that primary intended users might take. Inform is, we'll keep you informed of the evaluation's progress and findings, but you're not going to be involved in, helping gather data or be more, day-to-day involved in what's happening. Consult will keep you informed and listen and provide feedback on how your input and influence the evaluation. So it's a little bit more of a back and forth than a kind of one-way engagement. work with you to ensure that your concerns are considered and reflected in options, and make sure you get to review and comment on options and provide feedback on how your input is used in evaluation. So it's, again, a little bit more deeply engaged. Collaborate. This is much more of a kind of co-creative process where we incorporate your advice, suggestions to the greatest extent possible, give people meaningful opportunities to be part of the evaluation and decision-making process. And then empower, really the idea that this is your evaluation. We offer options to inform your decisions, but you will decide, and we will support and facilitate implementing what you decide. And in some ways that really looks more like evaluation capacity building. I'm currently working with an organization where they're embedding principles-focused evaluation in their work. And so, you know, I started a more of a collaborative process where I was helping to uncover the principles, but then it's really been more of a process of empowerment to help them really see how to use those principles to inform their decision-making. And so it's kind of transitioned more into that role of empowering them and building their capacity to take it and run with it, so that, you know, in many ways I make myself obsolete. You know, I don't need to keep coming back to support them, and they're really doing the evaluation themselves. I'm going to actually pause on that tip 5. We're about halfway through the tips, and just see if there are any questions or comments before we move on. I've seen a few comments in the chat. Anything else burning that you want to say, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat, and I'll just give just a moment to catch up. And I'll take a sip of water. Okay, well, I'm going to keep going. Oh, here's one. How can an evaluator navigate a stakeholder group that wants to engage in all 5 levels? Great question. You know, I think it's really, there may be, you know, within a stakeholder group, there may be multiple interests, and, you know, there may be people who want to do, you know, within a larger group who want to be more informed and more consultative. Part of that is having that initial conversation where you bring those primary intended users together to really understand how they want to be involved and give them some options. So part of it is engaging through options. And you may end up with some of them really wanting to be at that informed level. And so maybe they aren't part of that group as closely. Maybe they only come to a few of the meetings, whereas you have like a core group that's really going to be more at the empower level. And so I think you can scaffold within a stakeholder group and find, you know, those who, if there's a core group where it makes sense for them to be at that empower level and others to be more and collaborate and inform, you can bring them in and out as needed. Certainly with the group that I was talking about, I have a core group of about 5 people who are meeting with me regularly to kind of talk through and create the evaluation tools and processes. And then there are others within the organization who then, you know, help implement that, but are not involved at like the creation level, right? And so it really is, it does work to determine kind of what level of involvement people want to have and have the capacity to have, and build a structure out where there are different options of how to be engaged. How do you communicate to a group that is lower power in a way that is empowering? That's a great question as well. I mean, I think that, you know, it's there is certainly the importance of building relationship and listening first, you know, kind of listening to their lived experience about how they've been involved. And then, you know, identifying the ways some people have power in certain ways and not other ways. And then really kind of asking questions about the ways that they have or haven't been involved in decision making and what that's been like. and whether or not they would be interested in having more of a stake in decision making. So I think it's more about listening and reflecting back on what you're hearing from them than just being like, well, you don't have much power, so let me help you with that. You know, it's more of a process of engaging them and listening to them and thinking about how to support that empowerment piece. How easy is it to identify and place people in the interest power matrix? It's sometimes the case that someone might be more or less powerful than they actually are. Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think some of that comes in that first step of the situation analysis. And it may be that, you know, you think someone's in a certain box and then they're actually in a different box, or, you know, things change. And so one of the things we say with the situation analysis, which is true here as well, is just that it's an ongoing process of looking at where people are, and it's not a one-time thing. So it may be that, you know, you uncover certain ways that someone has power that you didn't realize, and that they may be able to contribute in a different way. And so it's really not, it's staying nimble and flexible in that process and not trying to put people in a box and leave them there, for sure. It's really more of a starting place and a way to kind of get things going and pay attention to those dynamics than it is to like be something that is rigid and puts people in a place that you can't get them out of. You had a situation where they want the empower level, but are closed off to building their evaluation capacity. I think that the biggest thing that I have found is time constraints and restrictions, particularly at, you know, smaller organizations where people are wearing multiple hats and doing a lot of things. Like they may really want to do the evaluation and have that capacity building process, but like it's always ends up kind of falling by the wayside when other things get busy. And so I certainly think that it's part of it is helping people identify like what their capacity really is. And we'll talk a little bit in a minute about sort of the different responses people have to evaluation. And it is finding those people who are enthusiastic about building the capacity, as well as kind of finding people who maybe already have a good base of knowledge and building on that. So it's definitely a conversation, right, that you have to have about where people are at, what their capacity currently is, and what they're willing to invest in it. And sometimes it may not make sense to be that deeply involved if they don't have the time or resources to commit to that. So, all right, thanks for the questions. I'm gonna take another sip of water and we'll move on to the next thing. And I think Michael will be joining us shortly too, so he'll have a lot to contribute as well, I'm sure, examples. Thanks for bearing with us. So tip 6, determine how many primary intended users to engage. So it may vary from one primary intended user, you know, if you really just have kind of a very specific person who's leading the charge in an organization, to a fairly large group representing several different constituencies, like a task force of program staff, clients, funders, administrators, board members, as we've said. The core group that's most heavily involved in designing the evaluation and setting priorities, negotiating, interpreting findings really needs to be manageable, which usually means fewer than 15, often closer to 6 or 10, enough for a diversity of perspectives, but still manageable. And that may be where you come at some of those other things where some people are being informed, or, you know, you're consulting them, but they're not as deeply engaged. And so really thinking about what you can manage in terms of that core group that's really making those decisions and setting priorities. Often that, you know, needs to be a smaller group of like 6 to 10 people. Oops, sorry, there was one more on that side. So tip 7 is then the recruitment process to recruit primary intended users. So once you've identified potential primary intended users, invite them to participate in a way that will attract their service and their commitment. This is kind of what I was saying earlier about kind of a kickoff. kickoff engagement process where you explain the importance of primary intended users throughout the evaluation process, get them, understanding that idea that it's not meant to just be something that's delivered, but that you really want them to be involved, and why you believe their particular involvement is important and could contribute to the evaluation's relevance and use. Listen to what they care about. This is that process of kind of where you're kind of understanding where they might be, both on those 5 kind of actions, possibilities, as well as in the power interest grid. That's where you continue to kind of hone that and adapt that. Think about, adapting your recruitment message to be meaningful to those people. And keep in mind that this isn't a favor that they're doing to you. They're making a contribution, and, that it's something that they presumably care about. And so really wanting to make sure that you give them a chance to understand their value, and find a way to become meaningfully engaged. Also, it's important to consider what the potential barriers might be to certain stakeholder groups in participating as primary intended users and representatives. Groups might, as I've said before, have been traditionally marginalized or excluded from the evaluation process, might not see the value in participating. So ideally, these maybe issues would have surfaced during situation analysis, but that will require attention to ensure that access to being involved in the evaluation process is equitable and open, and making sure that your team has the relationships and the cultural competence to be able to engage with different primary intended user groups. So let's see. I have one more question. Could we use evaluation actions as double science bridge between politicians, public administration beneficiaries of public services? I don't know if I understand that question, so if you want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to. I also see that Michael has joined us, and so perhaps he wants to pop in by taking that question, or just say hi and jump in here. Hi. We are on tip 7 of primary intended users. Do you have any perspective on that question, or do you want Sabina to expand on that at all?
Maybe you'd read it again. I didn't quite.
Sure, yeah. No problem. She's asking, or they're asking, could we use evaluation actions as a double science bridge between politicians, public administration, beneficiaries of public services?
Yeah, great question. And in this polarized time, I think that one of the features of the personal factor is trying to facilitate dialogue among different perspectives. And increasingly, one of the implications of the personal factor and of utilization-focused evaluation in general is the need to facilitate people of different perspectives. That includes the people representing political persuasions, public policy makers, the general public. So the facilitation skill that's part of interpersonal evaluation is becoming increasingly important, and I think it can be a bridge. The key is actually helping people stay focused on the issues, the questions, the data, and not getting into other kinds of issues, but to figure out what is it. It's famously said that everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own data. And so part of our contribution is to try to get an evidence base that people can agree on, so that then they can dialogue about its interpretation and meaning across differences.
Great, thanks. Well, I'll keep going through the tips and give you a chance to add your perspective as well. So our 8th tip is to organize and engage primary intended users. So this is really where we're nurturing users' interest and developing their capacity to engage in an evaluation. And as Michael just said, this requires facilitation and training skills to better engage users, demonstrating cultural confidence and sensitivity, and strategize about that appropriate involvement. So really making it clear some of the things that they can help to accomplish. Determining the purpose of evaluation, establishing concrete evaluation criteria, selecting appropriate methods, setting timelines, conducting preliminary data analysis, and sharing results. So, as I said earlier, it might be helpful to organize them into a working group for decision-making and involvement. And so there may be some primary intended users who are really, more deeply involved in that process, and others that are at different levels. And so they don't all have to be at the same level of involvement. But as the evaluator, you'll be really responsible for monitoring the ongoing availability and interest and participation of those primary intended users to keep the process energized and anticipate turnover, which can certainly, depending on the timeline of the evaluation, be a big factor in engagement of primary intended users. Michael, do you want to offer any insights or examples of that?
As you've mentioned earlier, in selecting and getting the process started, it becomes important to get the time commitment to engage at this level and to budget in the evaluation budget for the evaluator to spend time facilitating. What we found is the field of evaluation in general has moved to believing it's important to involve stakeholders in determining the purpose of the evaluation, what the primary evaluation questions are. What remains controversial about utilization-focused evaluation is involving stakeholders and primary intended users in selecting methods and interpreting data. The dominant modality is still to work with stakeholders to identify priority questions, but then evaluators select the methods and do the analysis from there, and then report back to the users. Having the primary intended users actually involved in methods decisions and data interpretation, both to understand fully the data, because these aren't purely technical decisions, but in fact are value decisions and trade-offs. We think that is important. It's proved well for getting greater ownership, understanding, and use, but it remains a very controversial part of this, and a part that takes particular skill. Facilitating people generating questions and what they're most concerned about is one thing. The facilitating methods choices and data analysis is a different skill set. And that's one that becomes important to work with if you're going to do this kind of engagement.
And that leads us to this next tip of maintaining engagement throughout, and really this idea of facilitating high quality interactions among and with primary intended users. So the quality of the engagement really trumps how often or how much they're engaged. So it's important to really check in regularly with primary intended users to ensure that they're engaged and continue to see value in the process, and facilitate a climate of openness that's co-created with that working group. So that takes some time up front to facilitate group identity, trust, and willingness. Depending on the group, you may have a group that has worked together a lot in the past, potentially from a single organization, versus a group of people, primary intended users coming from lots of different places, different stakeholder groups, and different organizations. And so that's going to be a different facilitation challenge than, an internal organization, for example. So, when I talk about working with an entire school district, you've got definitely lots of different primary intended user stakeholder groups that have different levels of power and interest, and that requires a much different type of facilitation than when I'm working with a single organization to build their internal capacity to design and run their evaluation, because they're used to working together all the time. So that's, as Michael said, facilitating the methods decision takes another level of your own ability to really be comfortable with providing options and giving information about the pros and cons of different things. So lots of different facilitation challenges to ensure that maintaining that engagement throughout. Anything you want to add to that?
One of the things that can be helpful is to stage the inquiry so that there's some findings coming in along the way. There sometimes in identifying the questions, there's some short-term issues that can be answered more quickly, some medium-term kinds of issues. So for example, some of the work that Charmagne's just been involved in education involved interviewing a group of stakeholders and teachers and district officials on their perspectives, and then reporting that back. And there was more data together later on about the process. And so what designs often do is they design something so that all the questions get answered at one time at the end, instead of looking, are there some shorter term, medium term, longer term? Are there some rapid feedback kind of things that can be done quickly that keep people engaged along the way and keep them updated on how things are going?
Yeah, absolutely. And then I mentioned this, but depending on your timeline, anticipating and dealing with primary intended users, this can really derail an evaluation, particularly a utilization-focused evaluation, if you're not watching for it and anticipating with it. And so really ensuring multiple intended users, and certainly if you're working with one primary intended user, making sure you have more of those conversations about how to engage some other people, especially if turnover is likely, and bringing new people up to speed quickly. So in one organization that I have worked with, they really build it into their onboarding. They build in some evaluation training so that people understand the evaluation process that's happening. And I record a training that kind of helps get people up to speed, and then be sure to really have time to meet with them and talk to them about what's happening in the evaluation and get their buy-in and increase their ownership of the evaluation. Stan says, I found communication and collaboration skills are extremely important, as well as everyone having a clear understanding of the terms like challenges versus deficits. Yeah, getting people to really think about how they're understanding what you're talking about, and getting people on the same page can really be an important step that sometimes we skip over and then realize late in the game and have to come back to. So thank you for that.
And Saranga added a comment that we have example of extending the evaluation timeline to the utilization phase, which brought many changes to the organization. And so when we talk about maintaining engagement throughout, we are talking about that added follow-through phase, not just the reporting of findings, but into helping people use it. And that can involve sometimes some additional primary intended users, but also, as Charmagne has said, really watching for turnover in those different phases along the way as people gather with it. Teresa says, we struggle with regular priority user turnover, which constantly shifts the style of and the type of facilitation. And it really does. It's just one of the realities of things, is to be prepared to meet with new users and figure out what their perspectives are. Sometimes you can add things into a design with new users, or some things that we've had the experience where there was data that was a lower priority initially, but with the turnover and the new director, some of that lower level data became a top priority data. And so there's a constant checking in about what's important and what is of interest to new people. And sometimes you can add in the design or add some additional data collection or interpretation as new people come into the process.
Yeah, and there is a question about capacity of stakeholders to effectively engage, and that certainly, can be a challenge. And so it is really going back to those different levels of engagement, from inform all the way to empower, and really trying to understand what people's time availability is, as well as what their knowledge level is, and what, depending on what you mean by capacity, whether it means having to do some evaluation capacity building with a group, or making sure that people's time availability is there, but also providing different ways to be engaged, so that it's not like everyone has to be involved at the level of deep empowerment evaluation, but that there are different ways to keep people engaged, informed, consulted with, so that they feel part of it and still bought into the process without having to, do it all.
The additional incentive for the capacity building piece that I like to emphasize when we work with intended users is that what they'll be learning as part of the evaluation, and that capacity and their engagement will not just be for this evaluation, but that in fact it will help them make more sense of the news, will help them be sophisticated about interpreting data in general, will help them make evaluation more a part of the future work that they do and whatever kind of work that they're doing. So we like to emphasize that the engagement in a particular evaluation has more payoff than just that evaluation, and that they'll be learning things and picking up capacity. Often when there's a facilitation going on at any given stage, I'll begin by bringing some item from the news into the discussion and relate it to what we're talking about, and to show the relevance of what we're doing, whether it's the kind of questions that are getting asked, the kind of methods that are being used, that there's always data that can be talked about. And so, for example, if I was working with a facilitation, a group today, I would be talking about the difficulty of interpreting the mask mandates in the United States, and the evidence about when and when not to use masks, and the changing public policy about that, as a way to talk about the challenges of evidence, because that's very much in the news. So it gives people an incentive to do the capacity building beyond just that evaluation, but to be able to think evaluatively more generally. And I find that the folks involved really value that, and that increases their degree and steadiness of participation, because they're getting more out of it than just that contribution to that evaluation.
There's some chatter on the chat about engaging beneficiaries in, to what extent should they be engaged. And Bob has a anecdote about, the beneficiaries withdrawing from the evaluation and really using that to undermine evaluation processes, but also, to what extent are they primary intended users? And I think that is a conversation to have up front, as, as a stakeholder group, what makes sense, what level of engagement would make sense for direct beneficiaries as primary intended users, and the risk certainly of not engaging them, of, both evaluation credibility and use, and the potential to derail decision-making processes. I mean, I think that one of the most dangerous things is to engage direct beneficiaries in the evaluation process, but have them not see that information get used. Can be kind of the opposite of what you want, can be really disempowering and kind of reinforcing some of the traditional dynamics of power. And so you really have to have some of those open, honest conversations about, are you prepared to actually, hear and cede some of the power to this stakeholder group as primary intended users. I did a evaluation of a youth homelessness project, and there were a lot of power dynamics with mentors and youth, and really trying to understand how the youth might feel like they were being brought into this process that didn't didn't connect with their lived experience and feel sort of angered at, being made to be part of a process that didn't match with kind of how they do things. And so really having to redesign things to make sure that they actually felt empowered and didn't feel just further marginalized by the process. Do you want to say anything more about that?
Bob Williams added an example about a group pulling out of the evaluation. And I've had a number of situations where the power dynamics or the polarization gets to a point where the evaluator has to decide whether to say we can't go forward. If the conditions have changed enough, if the primary intended users are not engaging, if the people who the evaluation is for whatever reasons, other issues in the organization withdraw, that's a time to rethink whether or not to continue with the evaluation. Not just to plow forward when you've lost the primary users. I've ended evaluations, and sometimes you have to pull these power dynamics, make them explicit. I had a situation in the Hennepin County, where Minneapolis is located, where I was helping facilitate the implementation of a new evaluation system throughout the county. And it was a big workshop that involved 500 people, because every unit of the county was implementing this. And I was doing both the initial presentation and then facilitating the workshop where they introduced. And I had talked with the executive, the county executive, and the chair of the county board that because this was so important, they needed to be present throughout the workshop. Not one of these deals where they send out a memo telling everybody how important it is, but they don't show. And their subordinates told me that although both of them promised to come and spend the day, that would never happen. And I should be prepared for them to come and tell everybody how important it was and then leave. And so I sent them both an email reminding them that they had said they would stay all day and that was an important part of legitimating the process. So we got to this conference center, and the 500 people are there. This is in mid-December. And I got the phone call saying that there was something at the state capitol, that both the county executive and the chair of the board were not going to be able to come. And so I turned to the group and opened the session, and I said, well, it's great to have everybody here. I've got a surprise gift for you. You just got a whole day free to go do holiday shopping, because the chair of the board and the county exec both promised to be here and participate all day, and they're no longer able to do that. And so we're not going to proceed without them, because their presence is important to this. They were so angry that they told me I would never work again in the county. But word got out, and as I worked in other places in Minnesota and somebody promised to tell me they were going to be there, I got more leverage out of that story of people. If they said they were going to be there, they better be there, or I was going to call them on it. So sometimes you have to call on this stuff. Don't just keep going if it's all coming apart. Name it. It's coming apart. I worked with an education department that had polarization. There were two groups that weren't getting along. I sent them off separately to talk about what their questions were. They came back. They were really contentious. And I said, look, it's clear that you folks can't come together around an evaluation or anything else. So it's over. I got other stuff to do. I'm not going to pretend that we can move forward under these conditions. And they were so angry that they said, you can't do that. And I said, well, then you're going to have to work together. And they said, we can work together. And that forced them to come together. We actually ended up having a really good experience, but I had to call them on the crap. So evaluators are not powerless in this. When you're doing a situation analysis, when you're seeing what's going on, when that stuff happens, especially with the people in power, call them on it. That's part of what our role is, as far as I'm concerned. And that involves some risk, but in my experience, it pays off long-term in terms of the credibility of having people make commitments and follow through on their commitments.
We're getting to time here, and so there are a couple more things in the book about kind of how to respond to various reactions to evaluation, different sort of stereotypes of potential users, as well as some temptations away from staying focused on users. So invite you to check those out in the book. But I also wanted to really elevate, because I know we have some Blue Marble folks involved in this as well, this idea of the evaluator personal factor, that we all have skin in the game, and that this is really a shift from the evaluator stance as kind of independent to an interdependence, and making our own values explicit and transparent, and identifying our stake, particularly as we get into some of these much more transformative initiatives that are looking at global systems change. We may also be primary intended users of the evaluation as they impact the planet that we live on. And so really making that clear and thinking about how that impacts your work as well is really important. You want to say anything more about that, skin in the game?
Well, that example I just gave was a version of skin in the game. If we're talking about credibility and authenticity and honesty, then when people tell us they're going to make commitments, we have to honor our commitments, but we also then have to deal with others. And a big part of the personal factor that we come to appreciate is the personal factor really began by talking about the stakeholders and their importance. But one of the things we've come to recognize is that there's a personal factor for evaluators too. Who you are, what your values are, what brings you to the work, what you care about becomes a factor. And so unlike research methods where presumably the methods dominate and different researchers using the same method would come up with the same results, that's not true for evaluators. Evaluation, who the evaluator is, their relationship, what they bring to it, means that each evaluation is going to be different because of the interactions between the evaluator and the primary intended users. And we have to own that and acknowledge that the personal factor applies both to evaluators, who we are, and to the people we work with. And we do have skin in the game. My credibility is on stake every time I do an evaluation. And I tell people that. That's why I'm committed to doing it. I also tell them that their credibility is at stake, because I tell them, I write books about evaluation, write books with my daughter about evaluation. We always need good examples, but we also need bad examples. And at the beginning of the evaluation, I said to them, we never know if you're going to be a bad example or a good example. However it turns out, I'm going to write about it.
So our big takeaway is relationships matter. Evaluation is a people business, and really are grateful that you all are here with us. And hopefully you will come back next month when we will be talking about our next, our third principle. And we want to invite you to follow Michael on YouTube, and certainly send us any questions or thoughts or feedback that you have. Love the feedback in the chat, and Michael and I can stay on for just a few minutes if anyone has any lingering questions, but I'll go ahead and end the formal webinar. Thank you for being here, and hope to see you next month.
Thank you very much. This was great.
Thank you.